All right, I think we're all back again from not really having been away. So Sebastian Köhler, welcome in our midst, and really nice that you accepted our invitation. So Sebastian Köhler, he works in the philosophy. I've written it down. It's too long to remember. In the philosophy and law department of the School of Finance and Management of the University of Frankfurt.
It's actually the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management, not of the University of Frankfurt, but it's fine.
So it had nothing to do with the Frankfurt School.
No, except for subverting the name.
All right. Yeah. Okay. So he works in ethics, meta ethics, the ethics of IT. So on personal identity. So we're going to listen to him. Responsible AI through conceptual engineering. So this is a really big thing in contemporary philosophy, conceptual engineering, and I'm really looking forward to what you're going to say about it. Take it away.
Thanks. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation as well. And thanks for organizing this event. Actually, there's also one correction. That my department recently became the Department of Philosophy and Computer Science, or computational science. So, but that doesn't really matter. Okay, so thank you all for being here. So I made this presentation based on the assumption that at least some people would have read the assigned paper. So the paper is the presentation is a little bit of it's more rough, and more details are to be found in the paper. But I'm open to both questions on the presentation and on the paper. So this is based on a published paper that I wrote together with Johannes Himmelreich, who is here only in spirit today, and some of the stuff that's in the presentation is actually different from what is in the paper, because about how I've started thinking about some of these issues has changed a little bit since we wrote this paper. So this project actually also brings together two things that I've been independently interested in. So, namely, on the one hand, the ethics of AI, and specifically questions regarding responsibility, and on the other hand, questions in meta philosophy or meta ethics that concern what we call conceptual engineering. So, here's the kind of commonplace starting points for this paper. So, recent years have seen incredible advances in AI. ChatGPT is like a hot topic that everyone is talking about, but of course there are other kinds of developments that that kind of people have started thinking about. And as you may all be aware of, these advances raise questions, ethical questions. I mean, they also raise philosophical questions, but I'm mostly going to focus on the ethical questions. Sometimes these questions even seem to be new kinds of questions that we haven't faced before. So there are questions about what's the status, the moral status of AI. There are questions about how should AI decide when it's faced with certain kinds of questions and so on. And then there are also questions about who's responsible when something bad happens. Now, the general thesis that I think is correct is that when we do think about these questions, questions concerning AI, conceptual engineering is going to have to play a crucial role in our thinking about these questions. And that's a more general thesis than the thesis that I want to focus on here, and that the paper focuses on, which is because the paper only focuses on one specific type of problem, which is what we call the responsibility gap problem. But I do hope that what I do say about the responsibility gap problem and the argument that I try to develop also gives us reasons to believe the more general thesis. Okay. So the talk and the paper, they have basically two aims. The first aim is to propose a certain kind of argument for the claim that we should at least partially approach this problem, which I call the responsibility gap problem, as a conceptual engineering problem. And I'm going to explain in a little bit what I mean when I say that. The second aim is to then illustrate how we would approach this problem when we take this perspective on the problem. Okay, so it's an important caveat here, of course, is that the paper is it's programmatic. So it doesn't really argue for one specific solution to this problem. So it doesn't say this is how we should deal. This is what the stance we should take on the problem. It's more, yeah, so it's programmatic and methodological. So basically what the paper argues is, if we want to make progress on this issue, then we need to see that the problem is a problem, at least to some extent, of a certain kind, that we need to approach using a certain kind of method. Namely, we should see it, at least in part, as a conceptual engineering problem. And the general point here, of course, is that the kinds of advances in AI that we're talking about here, that pose these problems, what they do is they kind of challenge our conceptual repertoire, right? The way how we conceptualize the world. And because this is the case, we need to explicitly consider how we can improve how we conceptualize the world in the face of these challenges. Okay, so that's basically the introduction. So here is how the paper will proceed. First, I'm just going to say very briefly what the responsibility gap problem is. Then I'm going to give you my argument for the thesis that we should approach this problem as a conceptual engineering problem. And then I'm going to basically sketch what dealing with the problem might look like if we see it in the way that I suggest. And then I'm just going to have one slide where I'm concluding. And that's it. Okay. So first point, what's the responsibility gap problem? So again, a little bit of setup. So recent years have seen incredible advances in due to incredible advances in the computational power that we have, the methods for data collection and storage, and advances in machine learning, we can build systems, artificial systems, that can execute certain kinds of tasks, and these tasks that they can execute are becoming increasingly complex. Right, so if you think about a spam filter, right, that's a task that's pretty simple. But then compare that with something like ChatGPT, where you can type in a question and then it gives you an answer. Might be a good answer, might be not a good answer, but I mean it's still quite a complex task. So the system are getting better and better at doing certain kinds of things that we normally would think are things that only intelligent beings can perform. So we have these systems, they can perform certain kinds of tasks, and it seems quite plausible, at least for some kinds of these systems, to say that they're agents in some minimal sense, right? So it makes sense to talk about, to say that they're making decisions, right? not maybe in the sense that a human, a moral agent would do, but in a more minimal sense, you can basically explain what it is that they're doing by appealing to their representations and their goals, right? So if you think about a chess engine, for example, chess engine is trying to win, right? And you can explain what moves it makes by appealing to certain kinds of representations. So it makes sense to say that they're agents, and this is of course the most important part. Not only are they agents, but they also at least some of them are agents that are autonomous in a certain minimal sense. Namely, they're autonomous in the sense that they can do what they do independently of humans controlling what it is they're doing, right? So they can make expert decisions on their own and without the need for human interference, right? So, okay. So I'm just going to, for simplicity's sake, call the systems that we're talking about here artificial intelligences or AIs. And I'm just going to ignore any kind of questions about, are these systems really intelligent or anything like this? This is just a terminological choice. And if you want to say, well, they are not real artificial intelligences, that's fine by me. Okay. So why are these systems relevant in the context that we're talking about here? So these kinds of systems, as I already said, they raise all kinds of ethical issues. And one kind of ethical issue that people have been talking about and is the issue of the so-called responsibility gap problem. And here's one way of setting up the problem. So assume that we have a system of this kind and it causes a harm, right? So the gimmicky example here is, think of a self-driving car. Self-driving car is driving, making decisions in traffic, and then it makes it makes a mistake in its decision making, and a pedestrian is harmed in some way, right? And assume that we are thinking here about a case where this is a harm that could not have been predicted under reasonable assumptions by anyone involved in the process of building a system, and it was also not intended by anyone involved in this process, right? So it's not that the human driver hacked into the system because they wanted to harm this specific pedestrian or anything, right? So this is just everyone in the process did make reasonably sure that that harm would be avoided, and no one intended this harm, and also assume that this is so this is also for simplicity's sake, but just let's assume that it's a self-driving car in autonomous mode and there's no steering wheel or anything, right? So the user cannot interfere in this bonus. Okay, so the question that's driving the responsibility gap problem is this: who is responsible for this harm? And so it seems plausible, at least for realistic cases of artificial intelligence, to say that it's not the AI itself. And the reason for this is that the AI is not a moral agent, right? So because it lacks some sort of capacity that you need to have to be a moral agent. Of course, it's a difficult question here, which capacity this actually is that the AI is lacking. But if you do think about like realistic cases of self-driving cars, it's quite plausible that there's at least something that a self-driving car is going to miss that you need to have to qualify to be a moral agent who can be responsible for their action, right? Okay, so the AI is not responsible for the harm, but it also seems like there's no human agent who is responsible for the harm in this case. And there are many reasons that you could there are many things that you could appeal to here to make this plausible. And basically, the argument here is always that there's some condition for responsibility that the agency of the AI interferes with in this case. So it could be what we call the epistemic condition, right? So that you need to be able to foresee harm to so you can only be responsible for harm that you can reasonably foresee. Or it could be a different condition. So in the paper and in this talk, I'm just going to focus on what we call the control condition, which is the condition that you can only be responsible for outcomes that you have some relevant sort of control over. And here, basically, the reasoning is this: because there's no human who has control over the actions of the car at the moment where the accident occurs, there is no human who can be responsible for the harm. And that means that there's no one who's responsible for this harm. And this is basically the responsibility gap problem in a nutshell, right? It takes a little bit more to get, I think, to actually get the problem going, because you need an assumption along the lines of, but there should be someone who's responsible in this kind of case, right? So responsibility gap is a problem because we think there's something missing here, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be a gap. Otherwise, it would just be, there's no one responsible, but that happens all the time. When lightning strikes me and I'm harmed, no one is responsible for that harm. But wouldn't say that there's a responsibility gap here. So the responsibility, calling it a gap, kind of indicates that there's something missing that we would normally think. Okay. So this is the problem, and there's a huge debate about this specific problem, whether responsibility gaps actually do exist. Right? So some people argue, myself included, in fact, that responsibility gaps don't really arise, because for all of these cases, we kind of find someone who is responsible to the right degree. And some even argue along the lines that I hinted at when I just talked in what I just said earlier, is that maybe responsibility gaps aren't really a problem. Okay. Now, I'm just going to assume, for the sake of the paper, for the sake of the talk, that responsibility gaps would be problematic if they existed. And then the crucial question is, of course, do these kinds of gaps actually exist, or do they not exist? Right? So this is the crucial debate. You might think, but actually, what I want to say is that this is not really the crucial question to ask, especially at this point of the debate, where some people defend that there are responsibility gaps. There are other people who defend that there are no responsibility gaps, such that basically what we know now is that, you could answer the question in the positive or in the negative, depending on how you understand responsibility in this context. In a sense, I think it's not even the wrong question to ask at this point. It's the wrong question to ask to begin with, because we should begin with this question first, but let's bracket that and maybe talk about it in the Q&A. So we shouldn't ask, do responsibility gaps exist? Instead, we should think of this issue as a conceptual engineering problem. Now, it's going to become clearer in just a second what I mean by this. So, and the argument for this thesis is basically a two-step argument. First, the first step is just to make more plausible what I just hinted at, which is that whether responsibility gaps exist depend on what we might call the conceptual choices. So how we understand the concept of responsibility in this context, it depends on whether responsibility exists, gaps exist or not, depends on how we understand responsibility in this specific context. Such that we have to ask ourselves which understanding of responsibility is the correct understanding for our purposes. And then this is the second step of the argument, which is that to determine which conceptual choices would be the correct ones to make, we have to engage in conceptual engineering. Okay. So let's go into the details of this two-step argument. First step, responsibility. So whether responsibility gaps exist depends on conceptual choices. So basically, the assumption here is that the disagreement between those who think that there are responsibility gaps, people like Andreas Matthias, or Robert Sparrow, John Danaher, and people who think that there are no responsibility gaps, people like Sven Nyholm or Johannes Himmelreich. The disagreement basically is in part a disagreement about the underlying concept. In this case, it's a disagreement about responsibility. So plausibly, what the actual content of the concept is to some extent indeterminate. And there are different ways how you could make the concept precise without changing topic, right? So I think personally, I always like to go to the free will debate to kind of illustrate why I think this is possible, right? So that's like libertarians about free will might think maybe free will is just an irreducible concept, and then compatibilists might offer an analysis of what free will means, and then the libertarians might say, oh no, that's not the correct understanding of free will. But they wouldn't say, oh, now you're changing the topic. Now you're talking about something completely different. They're saying that doesn't capture what free will is about, but it could be a possible way of understanding free will, right? It's not like they're completely changing what it's not a complete change of topic, right? So compatibilism is not so offering you a compatibilist analysis of free will is not the same thing as saying I'm going to say something has free will just in case it is green, right? So that would be a complete change in topic. And given that the concept is to some extent indeterminate, whether or not these gaps exist depends on how we fix a specific concept regarding this concept. And basically what defendants of what those people who think that there is a problem, what they're doing is they're arguing based on a conception of responsibility, which presupposes some sort of robust notion of control, which is absent in human and AI interactions, right? So it's some sort of ability to causally intervene to prevent the outcome or something along those lines. And if we understand responsibility in this way, then we get responsibility gaps. Others, on the other hand, who think that there are no responsibility gaps, they have a conception of responsibility which might require less demanding relation than this robust notion of control. Maybe it's a relation where you only need to have control over probabilistic outcomes, right? Or where you need to have only stand in a supervisory relation to an agent to be responsible, and so on. And if we have this weaker conception of responsibility, then we can avoid responsibility gaps. And so basically, whether there are, so this is the point of the argument, but whether there are responsibility gaps basically depends on how we understand responsibility. Do we understand responsibility as requiring this robust notion of control, or do we understand responsibility in a weaker way, where it doesn't? Okay, so if we accept this, right, if we accept that basically we could give a negative or a positive answer to the question, do responsibility gaps exist, depending on what choices we make about how we understand responsibility in this context, then the question, of course, is which understanding of responsibility is correct, is the correct one, is the one that we should choose, right? And now we're getting to conceptual engineering, because our suggestion is that correct conceptual choices in this context have to be understood as conceptual engineering suggested. So here again, we can consider one alternative, right, which I think is like basically the other main contender, right, for answering this question, which is, how do you answer which understanding of responsibility is correct? Well, you just need to figure out what the actual content of responsibility is, right? So you need to engage in some sort of conceptual analysis. You need to figure out, one model that I really like about conceptual analysis is you basically figure out how people employ the concept, and then you try to find that content that makes most sense of our dispositions to apply the concept. And one suggestion here is, well, what we should just do is we need to figure out what the best analysis is for responsibility. So we need to do some conceptual analysis, and then we've answered our question. But I think this is actually not the right answer in this context. And the reason why it's not the right answer is that it seems like pointing to the content of what the content of our actual concept is doesn't really have the right normative significance for the context for this issue that we're interested in, right? So suppose that someone said, so let's assume like a Magic Christmas Land type of scenario where someone says, oh, I actually have done a conceptual analysis, and I can tell you definitely that the actual content associated with the concept responsibility is the one that leads to responsibility gaps. It seems like even if that's true, we could still ask, well, so that's true, but does that mean we should understand responsibility in this sense? Given that we could change what responsibility means, right? Shouldn't we just go with one, given that, if responsibility gaps are problematic and we can avoid them if we understand responsibility in a slightly different way, shouldn't that be how we understand responsibility? And of course, the similar like type of argument, just maybe to make it more plausible, think about other cases, right? So suppose someone said, I have done conceptual analysis, and I can tell you that the concept of marriage makes same-sex marriage impossible, right? There's no such thing. It's an incoherent thing. Marriage, conceptual analysis reveals that marriage has to be between people of the opposite sex. Then it seems like perfectly fine to say, well, yes, okay, but I mean, then we should just change the meaning of marriage, right? Because that this is what we actually mean doesn't really matter for this context. And the same for responsibility. And this is why we shouldn't approach this question using conceptual analysis. Instead, what we have to do is we have to figure out what our concepts ought to be, right? Which is, this is the core question of conceptual engineering, which is, it's basically a methodological approach that is concerned with concepts and the words we use to express them, right? So basically what conceptual engineering is all about is not figuring out what our words or concepts, what the actual content of our words and concepts is, but what the best content for these words and concepts would be, how we ought to understand what the meaning of these words ought to be, right? So we shouldn't really be interested in what marriage actually means. We should think about what it could mean, such that, you know, that's the best understanding of marriage. And one crucial observation here, I think, I'm not sure everyone in this literature would share this, but I think one crucial observation here is that basically is that words and concepts, they do certain kinds of things with us, which provide us with reasons for or against using them, right? So, and some of these reasons could just be epistemic reasons. So, for example, maybe because they help us get true beliefs about our environments, right? So, we have good reasons not to use the concept phlogiston, right? Because phlogiston doesn't really track anything in the environment. It doesn't improve the truthfulness of our picture of reality. So we should probably give up that concept, right? And so on and so on, right? And some revisions in our concept might allow us to actually track things in our environment in a better way, right? So maybe, you know, think about maybe, hopefully everyone is familiar with this example. So think about GRU, right? The concept of GRU, which picks out a kind that's less natural than the kinds green and blue, right? So if you have concepts that allow you to track green and blue, you have a concept that gives you a more accurate representation of reality than different one. And that might mean that you have to change your conceptual repertoire. But having an accurate picture of the environment isn't the only thing that gives us reasons to change our conceptual repertoire. Concepts also do other things, more practical things for us, right? So they allow us to voice our disapproval about certain kinds of things, or highlight that there is a problem, and so on. So think about, again, the example that I used, right? So saying that the concept marriage, for example, has a certain kind of normative significance that goes beyond just picking out something in the world, right? And because it does this additional thing beyond just tracking something in the world, you can ask yourself question, basically, well, how could we use, or what would be the best meaning for this word, considering what it does, right? What the practical effects are of what it does. In the paper, we use this example of different example, which is the example like democracy, right? So when we say that some form of government is a democracy, there's a certain kind of, you know, positive evaluation that goes along with it, right? And so you can use that positive association to do all kinds of things, right? So for example, you could say, actually, the best thing for us to do with the concept of democracy, given the kind of justificatory flavor it does, is to basically understand it in a way that we can highlight problems in certain kinds of governmental systems, such that saying, for example, Germany is not a democracy, right? That has a certain kind of effect such that, you know, you could use it to basically highlight that there's something amiss and so on. Okay. So basically the idea is words and concepts, they do certain kinds of things for us, both epistemic and practical, which gives us reasons to think about which versions of these concepts or words we should use. And based on these reasons, of course, we should and we can and should ask certain kinds of normative questions, right? So we should ask, what are the things that the concepts do for us and which ones are the most important ones? And so is the most important thing that a concept allows us to do track certain things in reality, or does the concept allow us to do other things, like, you know, highlight problems and so on. We also might ask ourselves, beyond the concept doing certain kind of things for us, are there other reasons we have that speak for or against the concept, right? So, for example, maybe we have a concept that has really beneficial effects, or it does something really important for us, but it also enables oppressive relations. That might give us a reason to give up the concept or revise it, and so on and so on. Okay. So conceptual engineering asks, what are the concepts that we ought to use, and provides specifically normative reasons for using a specific concept. And as such, when we ask the question, what is the correct understanding of, for example, responsibility, it basically naturally avoids the problems that I highlighted for conceptual analysis, which is basically the missing normative significance of the answer, right? So the fact that this is the actual content of responsibility, that doesn't really tell us whether this is the concept that we should use. But when we do conceptual engineering, basically the kinds of consideration that we bring forward immediately answer why we should use that specific concept. And so basically, when we ask for the correct choice of concepts, we should understand this as a conceptual engineering problem. Basically, the question is, what are the reasons that we have to use this concept? And how do we need to, what concept do we need to assign to the concept for us to do these kinds of things? And then going back, and this is basically includes the arguments, that means that the responsibility gap problem is also a conceptual engineering problem. Because, at least in part, because the one crucial question here is what conceptual choices about responsibility are the correct ones, and if the argument is the right track, then that needs to be understood as a question in conceptual engineering. Of course, just as a side note, and this is why I think this kind of argument could actually have a more general thrust. Similar kinds of arguments, of course, could easily be raised for other issues in the ethics of AI or other philosophical problems of normative significance. Now, of course, if this is correct, there are lots of crucial, thorny methodological questions and even philosophical questions, right? Questions about what are concepts and what does it mean to engage in conceptual choices, and so on and so on. And how would we even engage in this sort of normative enterprise that we're engaged with? And so in the paper we say, I think I still agree with this, this is actually good that we're facing these problems, because these are difficult problems, and if we do think that conceptual engineering is an enterprise that makes sense, we have to ask these questions and we have to resolve them in some sort of way. And thinking about these problems specifically applied to concrete problems might even help us make progress on the specific, more theoretical questions that we might face when we engage in conceptual engineering. Now, the paper doesn't really resolve these issues. Instead, what it does is to just sketch one way how we can make progress on the responsibility gap problem if we see it as a conceptual engineering problem. Now, we only have like 5 minutes left. So I'm just going to very broad brushly sketch I'm going to paint with an even broader brush than what the paper is actually doing, just to give us more time for questions and discussion. So basically, the idea here is, how should we understand, how should we approach this problem from the perspective of conceptual engineering? What we should do is we should investigate what understanding of responsibility would enable it to best perform its functions. And then what we need to, I'm trying to figure out on the fly how I'm going to broad brush paint the things that I'm going to say. So basically, in general, what we should do is we should, when we engage in conceptual engineering, so this is just, I can't really defend this here, but so this is just the assumption I make, is we need to kind of consider what are the important things that the concept allows us to do, which I understand just as figuring out what the normative functions of the concept are. Where normative functions are basically things that speakers can do with the concept that give us normative reasons to have the concept in our repertoire. Right? So the concept green allows us to pick out something in the world, and that is something that allows us to keep track of things. And this is a good reason for us to have the concept in our conceptual repertoire. So basically, we need to figure out what are the functions that responsibility plays, the normative functions. And then we need to figure out, can an understanding of responsibility that avoids responsibility gaps play these functions to a degree that is satisfactory compared to understandings of responsibilities that allow responsibility gaps. So basically, this is probably not the only way how we could deal with the problem, but so basically what we should do is, if we fix a content for responsibility such that it can still do the things that the things because of which it is important to have the concept in the first place reasonably well compared to an alternative that allows responsibility gaps, then given how that responsibility gaps are problematic, well, that gives us reason to, well, that at least means that we have no reason to opt for the kind of concept that allows responsibility gaps, because we know that we can opt for understanding responsibility in a certain kind of way, such that no responsibility gaps occur, but responsibility can still do the things because of which we should conceptualize the world in terms of responsibility. So this is basically, so here I'm talking about all the different kinds of functions, and basically in the paper, what we do suggest is that that is actually the case, right? So there are ways to understand responsibility, for example, along the lines Sandy Newholm suggests, who appeals to a weaker relation of supervision instead of the more strong relation of control that avoids responsibility gaps, but which can perform the important functions of responsibility at least as well as the more traditional conception of responsibility, such that there are plausible and feasible ways how we can engineer ourselves out of the responsibility gap problem. And it's not really a problem, I mean, and it's really, so if we take this approach, basically it's really irrelevant whether we're changing the meaning of responsibility or we're using the understanding of responsibility that was the actual content in the first place, because these questions really don't matter. These questions these questions aren't really that important. The important question is, how should we understand responsibility? And can the best understanding of responsibility help us avoid this sort of problem? Okay. So I'm just going to not go into the introduction and into the conclusion, because I think, again, it's probably better if we have more time for questions than me summing up what I already said. Yeah, so I think, again, sorry that this was very broad brush painting. Obviously, the most detail that I can give you is what is in the paper. So if you are interested in the specific details, I would encourage you to take a look at it. Otherwise, thank you for your attention. If you want to have the slides, you should feel free to send me an email, because nothing I say here really goes beyond what's in the paper, but yeah. Okay, thanks.
Well, thanks very much. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah. I guess my question is about the responsibility gap. And wouldn't it be the case that once you settled on some understanding, be that thin understanding of responsibility or thick understanding of responsibility, the responsibility gap disappears? So if you have a thin conception, then no one is responsible. It's like if a tree falls in the woods and kills someone, we can't say that someone was responsible for that death. Would this just be a phenomenon in the world that no one is responsible for? Or if you have a thick conception, then it's someone was responsible for the carbon capture, for example. So yeah, I'm struggling to find where that gap would still come about when you have fixed understanding. It seems like the problem is that we're going, well, what do we mean by responsibility? And that's where the gap comes from.
Okay, yeah, good question. So depending on whether or not, so basically the way I've understood the debate is basically we're assuming that if a responsibility gap occurs, that is problematic. And those who have, I'm not sure what you mean by thin or thick conceptions, but so those who think that responsibility gaps occur, they think, yeah, there is no one who's responsible. That's bad, right? So this is what they think. Like Sparrow, for example, in the Killer Robots paper, he says, like, if there's an autonomous weapon system commits an atrocity, no one is responsible. But it's bad. It should be. There should be someone who's responsible when an atrocity happens. And the people who say that there are no responsibility gaps, they are normally people who say, yes, it would be bad, but it doesn't happen. There are no responsibility gaps. So I think the situation you're imagining is a slightly different situation where I mean, there's basically the question is just, are there responsibility gaps or no responsibility gaps, without the added assumption that it would be a problem. And I think, yes, I mean, in a sense, and not understanding what you're suggesting is correct, but I think the way I see the discussion is more that people are assuming that would be a problem. And of course, we could challenge that, right? So I alluded to this earlier. So Peter Koenig has this paper where he says, even if responsibility gaps exist, they are not really a problem. Was that helpful?
Yeah,
Okay.
so kind of after what you're saying is that like the existence, the contextual existence of the possibility of this gap is problematic, and then we need a definition of responsibility that can account for that. And then we should get to that.
Well, we need a definition where if we assume that when they exist, it would be good if we had a definition where they don't exist.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. One thing I was wondering is these responsibility gaps that some people argue now arise because of technological advancements in AI. How, if at all, are those any different from responsibility gaps that arguably have always existed? So, say that large organizations over a long period of time bring about some terrible consequences, and well, no one really knew that it was happening, et cetera, et cetera. So it seems that there have always been, with at least somewhat complex human cooperation, possible responsibility gaps. So I was wondering, is there anything specific about responsibility gaps in AI, and if not, does this point apply just very generally? Also, maybe to questions about responsibility of the past behavior of governments in other countries, or maybe responsibility for agents involved in, I don't know, like animal agriculture or something like that. This is really more specific to AI.
Good question. So I think it depends a little bit on how we think about the corporation case, right? So I think there are plausibly cases that are in the corporation case. There are probably cases that are basically analogous to the AI case, which is where, you know, if we do think that corporate agents can be agents that act independently of what any of the individuals in the corporation do or want, right? Then we have a similar kind of thing where it might be that a corporate agent does something, but there's no human agent who's really in control of what the corporate agent is doing. And then in that case, I would say it's pretty similar to the responsibility gap problem for AI. But there are other cases. So there are cases which I think you were alluding to as well, like many hands cases, where the reason why it seems like no one is responsible is because very many people did something, and then something bad happened, but everyone just had made a tiny mistake or something like this. And I think this is a different kind of case. But I mean, people disagree about that as well. So
yeah.
I must say, very confused around what conceptual engineering is.
sure.
Because it seems to me that's a very broad definition, right? It says, when we have a conceptual problem with a concept, we engineer it, let's say, whatever that means. And depending on whether we engineer the problem may be resolved, right? In that case, it seems to me that pretty much all philosophy is conceptual engineering. In some sense, right? As far as philosophy, by and large, or arguably seems to deal with conceptual problems. Whether there's a problem with free will depend on what sort of concept of free will is built on. But then for me, the import of something like conceptual engineering is it offers some sort of clear methodology of how to get to the correct, what we can refer to as the correct conception. But then this is something that I guess was kind of said to be a first important issue. So I'm wondering, what's the input of just calling this conceptual engineering problem? It seems that what's essential is that we're offering this sort of methodology to the correct concept.
Okay. Also, excellent question. So I think. So I mean, I don't think that every philosopher would agree that what they are doing is conceptual engineering, because I mean, when you're doing conceptual engineering, you're asking basically, how should you understand this concept? And I think many people would just say, we should figure out what the actual concept is, right? So, another part of my research is in meta-ethics, right? And I think there people are basically, what they're interested in is, what do moral terms actually mean, right? They're not interested in the question, what's the best understanding or the best use of those concepts, right? So think about, so they're interested in what's the actual meaning of marriage, not in what's the best meaning of marriage, given what it does for us. So, and I mean, I think that also, so this is hopefully might help to answer the second part of your question, which is what's the benefit of saying that it's conceptual engineering? It's like, basically we're focusing on a different question, right? When we're focusing on the question, not what's the actual meaning of responsibility, but what's the best? How should we understand it? And so one way to bring out the difference is like, if you engage in conceptual engineering, like think about counterexamples, right? So think about, get your case to the analysis of knowledge is justified true belief. So the counterexample to that analysis it shows us that this is cannot be what knowledge actually means, right? But for a conceptual engineering approach, you could say, so what? Maybe justified true belief just is the best understanding for knowledge, because of all the theoretical virtues that understanding knowledge in this way has, compared to other more gerrymandered understandings and so on, right? So a counterexample basically, when you do conceptual engineering, you can say, yeah, that's a counterexample. That shows us this is not how we understand the term right now, but that doesn't mean that this is not how we should understand it.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have a very broad question. You identify kind of a danger with this conceptual analysis, that people basically give an analysis of what they want a concept to be, or that kind of seems to implicate their conclusions, or the argument that they're going to make, right? So marriage is between is a heterosexual marriage, and this has implications. But how do we really make sure that in the normative case, so what our concepts ought to be, that we don't run into the same mistakes of basically like engineering a concept that we desire this concept to be, instead of like looking at what is actually like, is there some truth tracking here? Is there some way that we try to have a concept that is like neutral, in the sense that we have found the true concept of something. We have found the true concept of marriage.
Okay, yeah. So also good question. So I think maybe I should clarify the problem that I want to raise for conceptual analysis, because I don't think my problem is the problem that you raise. So because I think the problem you raise is basically that when we make a proposal about what the concept means, could very well be that we smuggle in our own normative biases. And I think, yeah, that's a problem. That's a problem for everyone. And I think we should get rid of that with our ordinary methods of getting rid of bias, right? Like having an argument and then having a discussion about whether the argument is actually good or whether it's based on some sort of bias and so on, right? And so I think the problem that I have is a different problem, which is that suppose that in English, marriage, the word, means some sort of union between a man and a woman. Even if that's the case, we can ask, well, is that the best way to understand marriage, given, you know, the practical role it plays in our social and legal system? Maybe we should change. I mean, this is, you could say, in a sense, you could say, so for example, in Germany, when same-sex marriage was allowed, basically what the meaning of marriage in the law changed. Marriage before the change meant certain kind of union between a man and a woman, and then they changed the law, and now marriage in the law actually means something different. And the conceptual engineering, and basically the conceptual engineering approach says the fact that it means this thing in the law is irrelevant, because we should ask ourselves, what should it mean given what role it plays in the system? And I think that's a problem that you don't really avoid with conceptual analysis. And so, but there was a last element to your question, which I also would like to talk about very briefly, which is you said, what about the true meaning?
Is it true tracking, conceptual engineering kind of tracking?
Well, there is a sense in which you, there is a sense in which it could be truth tracking, but I'm not sure it's the same way you were thinking about, which is because, one thing, of course, that you could do is you could try to engineer your concepts such that your overall picture of the world becomes more truthful, right? So you could say, this is a gimmicky example because it doesn't really, that's probably not what the actual situation is like, but like you said, take a term, assume that the meaning of fish was such that it includes whales and dolphins, right? And compare that to a meaning of fish where it doesn't, right? Then it seems like from an epistemic standpoint, the second understanding is better because it better tracks the more fundamental things in the world.
Okay, so I want to pick up on this myself a bit.
Sure.
So to me, it seems that the basic question you are asking can be answered without conceptual engineering at all. So I want to push back against that. So when you say, well, there is this notion of conceptual of responsibility, meaning supervision, or the sort of relationship between parents and the children, right, as you say in the paper. If that's all between the minister and the people who work on in the department. Well, surely many people would say that's in those relationships there is responsibility. Those are and that's just a concept that's available in the language. It's not this super strong control notion of responsibility, which is another notion, perhaps analogically related to each other. So to me, it seemed that the whole exercise of saying, this is conceptual engineering in a way was, well, for targeting the question that you were really up to, by very traditional conceptual analysis, this could be, and in a way, this is what you're in fact doing in the paper. You're saying, hey, there is in the language, there's this concept of responsibility, meaning supervision, that's available. And we can apply this in AI cases. So I was unsure whether really anything like conceptual engineering was going on. We didn't really need that in the first place. So this is a critical remark. I'm curious what you...
Well, so, again, it depends a little bit on what we think. Obviously, there are different ways how we can understand responsibility, and let's just focus on the specific case of AI, right? So being responsible for the actions of an AI. Obviously, in ordinary language, there are different ways on offer how we could understand it, right? All of which we recognize as potential understandings of responsibility. So now the question is, should we ask, well, in the context of AI responsibility for human and AI interactions, should we ask, well, what does responsibility mean in that context? Or should we ask, how should we understand responsibility in this context to avoid conceptual engineering. Right, so sorry, to avoid responsibility gaps, and that's a different question. Right, so someone like Newham might either say, people are responsible because what responsibility means in this context requires some sort of notion of supervision. But you could object to that by saying, no, this is not what responsibility means in that context. And responsibility means in that context is, I've done some conceptual analysis, I've looked at how people apply the term and found the best way to make sense of that. And this is the actual content of what responsibility means in that context is different.
Well, so it seems to me that in the end that the solution that you are proposing in the paper is, well, there is this notion of responsibility in the meaning of supervision. And that seems to be available in the language all along. That's just one. And surely if these and so there is no responsibility gap at all if you buy into that notion of responsibility that is available all along. So you don't need there's nothing engineering going on.
But it's not available. It's not available for all contexts, right? You are not responsible for your own actions because you're supervising your own actions. You're responsible for your own actions because you have control over your own actions, right? So, and you're responsible for the actions of your children, not because you control them, but because. Right. So there's a difference. And then the question is, how should we understand responsibility for the case of the AI?
Right, and then you're saying, well, we should understand it in the second way.
Yeah.
And I'm saying, that was a meaning of responsibility that was available all along in the language, because parents, they were responsible for their kids. And so this really interesting exercise in the paper that you're doing, I thought, well, for this particular purpose, it looked to me a bit redundant. Because, hey, here's the material question: who's responsible for AI? Insofar as it gives negative effect. Well, here's the answer. It can be designers, it can be users, or it can be designers who haven't properly supervised the thing they've been engineering. Yeah, that seems okay. And then.
It's not necessarily okay, right? I mean, this is, so people like Matthias or Sparrow, they will say, no, they're not responsible, because the relation in which you would have to stand to the AI is this relation of control. And then, so, I mean,
but then
so one thing that maybe we just have different conceptions of what conceptual analysis is. And okay, that's fine. But then, I mean, I think your version of conceptual analysis just is conceptual engineering, which is also fine. I mean,
and actually, I thought the other way around. Your conception of conceptual engineering is just a form of conceptual analysis.
Well, the way, if I understand your notion of conceptual analysis, that's fine.
So may I ask Richard? I mean, he wrote about concepts. Do you want to weigh on this discussion or not? All right. Yeah, you have.
In conceptual analysis that we gave equality, we have to say, well, what functions should it have? Should we go for equality of opportunity, quality of resources? We try to look at like what the problems are in the world, what we want to solve. Yeah, we think about what equality means itself, but we also think about what its functions are. So do you think the equality of what debate, for example, is conceptual engineering or conceptual?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it could be both. It depends a little bit on how you approach this specific question. And for example, I mean, because in the I mean, you do have counterexamples in the equality of what debate, right? You have things like expensive tastes, for example. And then, so one crucial issue here is what's driving the counterexample. Is what's driving the counterexample, oh, that's not what we mean by equality. Or is what's driving the counterexample, well, that means that this sense of equality isn't really important, right? Which means that, I mean, what we're looking for is basically the sense of equality that matters, right? For these purposes.
Yeah, so this is the point I'm trying to get at, because when you talk about something like what is knowledge, or an active question like what is responsibility, we always have to look at the function. So it seems like the definition of conceptual engineering here is really just about the kind of problem that we have on our hands, which is an ethical issue, where there's normativity involved. What should that look like for us?
But so when we're doing conceptual analysis, yeah, we also might be looking at the function, but we're looking at it in a different way, right? I mean, because from the conceptual engineering point of view, as I understand it, I mean, we don't really do this specific thing in the paper, but I mean, what we should do is we should look at the functions also from the perspective of what's the most important thing that the concept is doing for us, right? And what the most important thing is that it's doing for us might not be the thing that actually determines what it means in ordinary language, right? So it could be that, yeah. So think again about the marriage example, right? So maybe the most important thing that marriage does for us is help us recognize certain kinds of relationships between people, right? Governance recognize certain kinds of relationships between people, while maybe what actually explains the actual content of marriage is more historically driven, right? Based on what marriage did for people in the past, right? That kind of determines what the actual meaning of marriage is. And then we should ask ourselves, so I mean, obviously, marriage does a couple of things for us. Which one of these is the most important one? And then we should go for that, which is, of course, not what we really do in the paper.
Yeah. So we started a little bit later because of the coffee. So, but I want to give the final word to Richard.
Well, yes, I just wanted to come in there. I mean, I suppose I'm on your side really in this debate because if you use the word engineering, suppose I've got a car part that and it serves a certain function in the car engine at the moment, and we say, well, actually, we want to do something slightly different, so we're going to engineer it so that it performs this other task. There's nothing in the notion of engineering which requires that new task to be in any way constrained by the old task. It could be a completely new task, and the part has been engineered to do something different. But I think what you want to say, I think the last question is something like the normativity here is driven by how the concept has been applied. That's why we're using the same word. You know, that's why we're not saying we don't want the institution of marriage at all. That's all pat, we want something completely different. No, we want to go on calling it marriage because you think what's going on here really is marriage, and the new type of marriage is being constrained by the old concept. You're shaking your head, no.
No. Not necessarily. I mean, obviously, we don't. I mean, there might. So it depends a little bit on how the concept of work was historically used is suffused with the thing that it's doing for us, right? I mean, so in the case of marriage, maybe the best thing would be to just get rid of the term and choose a new one, right? But maybe that term doesn't really have the practical significance because people have no association with the term, right? So, and that means that we can, I mean, in some cases, the best thing could be just to get rid of that old baggage, because it's like, because we can do the theoretical thing that we're supposed to be doing with the word or concept better with something that isn't so laden, right? So think about, I don't know, I'm not sure if this is a good example, but like think about race terms, for example, right? So race terms obviously always have problematic baggage, but you might think maybe there are certain kinds of things that you could be doing with them in the sciences, but maybe what you should be doing is you should just get rid of the old ones, and then you should use technical terms to do the new thing, right? And so I think the reason why sometimes the engineering is constrained in this way is because without the continuity to the old use, you don't get necessarily the thing that you're engineering for.